The photograph had survived fires, floods, and more than a century of neglect before it reached the restoration lab. Its surface cracked like dried skin and its faces softened into anonymity. At first glance, it was an ordinary family portrait from 1899. A stern father seated at the center, a mother standing just behind him with gloved hands folded, and two sons posed stiffly at either side. Their clothing was immaculate, their expressions restrained by the long exposure times of the era, their eyes carrying the dull patience of people instructed not to move. Nothing about the image suggested it held anything more than history. When the restoration began, the usual details emerged: fabric patterns, hairlines, the faint texture of wallpaper behind them. Then the technician noticed something odd. The space between the father's right shoulder and the backdrop seemed darker than the surrounding area, not shadowed in a natural way but dense, layered, as if something had been deliberately pressed into the image and later erased by time. Zooming in revealed irregular edges, too organic to be damage alone. It looked like the suggestion of a form. As clarity improved, the darkness resolved into shape. Fingers appeared first, pale and slender, resting gently on the father's coat. They were small fingers, unmistakably those of a child. The father's posture suddenly felt different, not composed but tense, as though he were holding himself still for someone standing just behind him. The mother's gaze, once thought to be aimed past the camera, now seemed slightly downward, focused on a point that no longer appeared empty. Records from the studio listed only 4 subjects present that day, no mention of a child, no explanation for the extra presence now emerging from the restored grain. And yet, as the image sharpened further, faint contours of a face began to surface from the background itself, woven into the shadows where the painted wall should have been smooth. The eyes were the clearest part, wide, direct, and far too aware for a trick of light staring out from a place the living were never meant to occupy. The restoration began as a routine assignment, kind that filled the long hours between more celebrated projects, and no one expected the 1899 family portrait to demand anything beyond patience. The photograph arrived sealed in a brittle envelope, its edges curled inward like paper that had learned to fear air. At first glance, it looked complete enough, merely aged. A seated father, upright and formal, a mother standing behind him, her posture disciplined into stillness. 2 boys positioned at either side, stiff as furniture. The background was a painted studio wall meant to suggest refinement, its faint patterns barely visible beneath decades of chemical decay. Nothing about the image hinted at mystery. It was just another preserved moment from a time when photographs were rare, deliberate, and solemn. The technician began with careful digital cleaning, removing surface cracks and discoloration layer by layer. As the software reconstructed missing detail, textures sharpened and contrasts deepened. Threads in the father's coat emerged, fine enough to suggest the weight of the fabric. The mother's gloves revealed subtle creases at the knuckles, as if she had been clenching her hands just before the shutter opened. The boys' collars appeared starched to the point of discomfort. Each improvement made the image feel less distant, more intimate, as though the family were slowly stepping forward through time. It was during this process that the technician noticed the anomaly. Behind the father's right shoulder, in the narrow space between his dark coat and the lighter backdrop, the shadows did not behave as expected. Studio portraits from that era were carefully lit to avoid harsh contrasts, especially in family compositions. Shadows were soft, predictable, and purposeful. This one was not. It was denser, irregular, with edges that seemed to resist clarification. Even as the surrounding areas became cleaner and more defined, that patch remained stubbornly obscure, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. At first, it was dismissed as damage, perhaps a chemical stain or a fold that had darkened unevenly over time. The technician isolated the area, adjusting levels and running comparison algorithms against known degradation patterns. The results did not align. The darkness was too structured, too intentional. It followed a vertical contour that suggested depth, as if something had once stood there, blocking the light at the moment the photograph was taken. Curiosity replaced routine. The technician overlaid historical references of the studio layout, using surviving records to estimate where lights and props would have been positioned. According to the diagrams, there should have been nothing in that space. No pillar, no curtain, no furniture. The father had been seated slightly forward, leaving the background clear and uniform. And yet the shadow persisted, not flattening under scrutiny but subtly shifting as enhancements continued, revealing layers within layers. As the image resolution increased, the darkness began to show tonal variation. It was no longer a single blot but a gradient, darker at the center and softer toward the edges. The shape narrowed near the top and widened lower down, mimicking the proportions of a human form standing just behind the chair. The technician felt an unexpected hesitation before zooming further, an instinctive pause usually reserved for images that carried emotional weight. This was supposed to be history, inert and silent, but the shadow felt present in a way that was difficult to articulate. The next enhancement pass brought an unsettling clarity. The boundary between the father's shoulder and the shadow sharpened enough to reveal a subtle overlap, as if the darkness were not behind him but partially in front, encroaching into his space. The father's coat, previously smooth along that edge, now appeared slightly compressed, the fabric folding inward as though something were pressing against it. This was no artifact of decay. Fabric did not distort itself decades after the fact. The technician leaned closer to the screen, tracing the contour with the cursor. The shape aligned too perfectly with the angle of the father's body, following the natural line a person would take if standing close, almost intimate. A chill crept in, uninvited and irrational, and the technician reminded themselves that photographs could deceive, that the mind was adept at finding patterns where none existed. Still, the evidence refused to dissolve under reason. When contrast was pushed further, faint highlights appeared within the darkness, not random but placed where light would naturally strike a surface. The suggestion of form became undeniable. There was a vertical line that could only be interpreted as the outline of an arm. Near the shoulder, a subtle curve hinted at a head tilted slightly forward. The space was no longer empty. It was occupied. What made it more disturbing was the family's relationship to that space. The father's posture, once read as formal stiffness, now seemed guarded, his shoulders subtly raised. The mother's hands, folded neatly at her waist, were angled toward the same dark region, her fingers aligned as though unconsciously acknowledging a presence there. Even the boys, positioned at the edges of the frame, appeared slightly turned inward, their gazes no longer symmetrical but drawn toward the center where the shadow loomed. The technician checked the original negative scan again, half expecting the anomaly to disappear under scrutiny. It did not. If anything, it appeared more pronounced, as though the restoration process had not created the shadow, but uncovered it. The realization settled slowly and heavily. Whatever had been there in 1899 had always been there, patiently embedded in silver and grain, waiting for technology precise enough to see it clearly. The room felt quieter than before, the hum of the computer suddenly intrusive. The technician saved the progress and leaned back, aware of an unspoken rule in restoration work: to observe without imposing narrative, to document without imagination. But the shadow behind the father's shoulder defied neutrality. It suggested intention, proximity, and a presence that the family in the photograph seemed to acknowledge even as history had forgotten it. The image no longer felt like a record of who had stood before the camera, but of who had not been meant to be seen, preserved not by choice but by the unblinking honesty of the lens. The decision to examine the area more closely was made with a mixture of professional obligation and unease, the kind that settles in when evidence begins to challenge assumption. The shadow behind the father's shoulder had already complicated the photograph's history, but it was still possible to categorize it as an unusual artifact, a quirk of lighting or exposure that resisted conventional explanation. That possibility narrowed as the technician initiated a deeper enhancement pass, isolating the region and reconstructing it pixel by pixel using data from the surrounding image. The goal was clarity, nothing more, yet clarity brought something entirely unexpected. As the darkness thinned under refinement, a pale shape emerged where no shape should have been. At first, it was only a curve, lighter than the surrounding tones, small enough to be mistaken for a smudge or a tear in the emulsion. But unlike damage, it possessed consistency. Its edges were soft but deliberate, the contours smooth in a way that suggested living form rather than decay. The technician adjusted brightness incrementally, watching as the curve resolved into knuckles, then into fingers, each one subtly defined, resting against the father's shoulder with a gentleness that felt disturbingly intentional. The hand was unmistakably small. Its proportions were wrong for an adult, the fingers short and narrow, the palm barely spanning the width of the man's coat seam. Fine details became visible as resolution increased. The slight taper of the fingertips, the faint suggestion of a nail bed, the delicate arc where the thumb met the palm. It was not clutching or gripping, it was resting, placed with familiarity, as though the gesture had been practiced many times before the photograph was taken. The technician froze the image, heart pounding harder than the situation seemed to warrant. In the late 19th century, long exposure times required subjects to remain completely still. Any movement would blur, leaving ghostly traces or distortions, yet the hand was crisp. Its edges were as sharp as the father's collar and the mother's gloves. This meant the hand had not moved during the exposure. Whoever it belonged to had stood there calmly, close enough to touch, long enough to be recorded with precision. Historical context only deepened the unease. Studio portraits from that era were meticulously staged. Families were arranged carefully, often with physical supports hidden beneath clothing to help them remain motionless. Additional people were not casually included. Every subject was accounted for, named, positioned. A child's hand appearing without a corresponding body defied both logic and protocol. There was no record of a fifth subject, no blurred outlines suggesting someone stepping in or out of frame. The technician compared the hand's scale against known measurements within the photograph, using the father's shoulder width as reference. The estimate placed the hand's owner at no more than 8 or 9 years old. Yet no child of that age was visible anywhere else in the image. The shadow behind the father now took on new meaning, no longer abstract but clearly connected to the hand's position, rising above it like a partial silhouette. The two elements aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Attention shifted to the father's expression. Previously read as stern neutrality, it now seemed strained. His jaw appeared set more tightly than the period's typical photographic severity, the muscles along his neck faintly pronounced. The hand rested exactly where tension would naturally gather, at the slope between shoulder and neck. It was an intimate placement, one that suggested reassurance or possession, and the ambiguity of that intent made the image feel suddenly invasive. The technician noticed something else. The father's coat beneath the hand was slightly indented. The fabric dipped just enough to imply pressure. A downward force applied by something with weight, however slight. This detail erased any remaining doubt that the hand had been added by later interference or digital error. The photograph itself bore the mark of contact. In 1899, light had struck fabric altered by that touch and fixed it permanently onto the plate. As the image continued to reveal itself, faint variations in tone appeared around the wrist area, as though the arm extended upward into the darker mass of the shadow. The boundary between hand and shadow was seamless, no abrupt cutoff, no sign of manipulation. It was as if the child stood partially erased, their presence fragmented by the limitations of the medium or by something far less technical. The hand had survived clarity while the rest had not. The technician's mind reached instinctively for rational explanations. Double exposure, perhaps, a photographic error where two images overlapped imperfectly. But double exposures from that era usually resulted in translucent figures or repeated outlines, not isolated body parts rendered with such solidity. Moreover, The lighting on the hand matched the lighting on the rest of the family precisely. The same soft highlights traced the knuckles. The same shadows fell between the fingers. It belonged to the scene in every measurable way. The emotional temperature of the photograph shifted. Family no longer appeared posed for memory, but assembled around something unspoken. The mother's downward gaze now seemed directed toward the hand, her eyes subtly aligned with it rather than the lens. The boys' stiff postures felt less like impatience and more like restraint, as though they were aware of rules not to acknowledge what stood too close to their father. The technician realized they were holding their breath. The hand, resting there for over a century, felt newly placed, as if it might withdraw at any moment. There was something profoundly unsettling about its stillness, about the quiet certainty of its position. It did not reach out for the camera or beg for attention. It existed in the photograph as though it had every right to be there. Documentation confirmed the impossibility. Studio logs listed only 4 names. No mention of a child, no additional fee, no notation of a late edition. And yet, the hand remained undeniable and unyielding. It transformed the image from a historical artifact into a question, one that pressed as insistently as the fingers on the father's shoulder, asking not how it appeared, but why no one had spoken of it until now. Once the existence of the child's hand could no longer be dismissed, the investigation shifted away from the photograph itself and toward the lives it had frozen in place. The technician understood that images from that era were not spontaneous records but deliberate constructions, each subject documented elsewhere in church books, census rolls, and municipal ledgers. If a child had truly stood with the family in 1899, there would be some trace of them in ink, however faint. What unsettled the technician was not the possibility of finding such a record, but the growing suspicion that the records might explain why the child was never meant to be seen. The family name, written in a careful 19th century script on the studio envelope, became the starting point. Census data from the late 1890 listed the parents and 2 sons living at the same address indicated on the photograph's backing. There was no mention of a daughter. That absence at first seemed conclusive. Many families had sons only, and the photograph itself supported that assumption. Still, census records were imperfect, often missing infants or children who had died between counts. The technician widened the search to parish baptismal registers, where births were recorded with greater regularity. There, tucked between entries written in the same fading ink, a name appeared. A girl, born 7 years before the photograph was taken, listed with the same parents, the same address, the same careful handwriting. Her name was followed by a date and nothing more, no later annotations to mark a marriage or departure. That alone was not unusual, but what followed in the burial records made the technician pause. Less than a month before the portrait session, a burial entry appeared for a child of the same name, the age matching precisely. The cause of death was not elaborated upon, merely described in a clipped, impersonal phrase common to the time. The timing felt deliberate, almost confrontational. Photographs in 1899 were not impulsive decisions. Families saved for them, scheduled them, prepared clothing weeks in advance. To proceed with a formal portrait so soon after burying a child suggested either an attempt at normalcy or a refusal to acknowledge loss. The technician found themselves staring again at the restored image, at the hand resting on the father's shoulder, and wondered which of those explanations could account for what the camera had captured. Further records complicated the story. School enrollment logs from earlier years listed the girl alongside her brothers, her attendance marked regularly until an abrupt stop. Neighbors' testimonies, preserved in a local dispute over property boundaries, mentioned a young daughter who often played in the yard, described as quiet, unusually attached to her father. Then suddenly, she vanished from the written memory of the town. No scandal, no prolonged illness recorded, no mention beyond the brief burial notice. It was as if the community had collectively agreed to erase her. The technician considered the customs of mourning at the time. Families often photographed the deceased, especially children, as a way of preserving their likeness. These post-mortem portraits were common enough to feel unsettling to modern sensibilities, yet this photograph was different. The child was not laid out, not clearly presented as dead. Instead, she was hidden, folded into the composition like a secret. The idea that the family might have insisted on her inclusion, standing where she always stood, sent a chill through the technician that no amount of rationalization could dispel. Returning to the photograph with this knowledge altered everything. The shadow behind the father no longer felt accidental. The hand was no longer an anomaly but a declaration. The family's body language, once merely stiff, now read as deliberate restraint. The mother's downward gaze suggested grief disciplined into silence. The boy's inward turn felt like obedience, an understanding of rules spoken only within the walls of their home. Even the father's tension took on new meaning, his posture no longer simply formal but burdened. The technician examined the burial date again, calculating the interval between death and portrait. It was enough time for the body to be prepared, enough time for the family to insist on one final appearance, but not enough time for grief to soften into memory. If the girl had been brought into the studio, dressed and positioned where she belonged, the long exposure would have demanded absolute stillness. Any movement, any instability would have betrayed itself in blur. The clarity of the hands suggested not just stillness, but intention, a careful placement maintained throughout the exposure. What disturbed the technician most was the absence of denial in the records. There was no attempt to rewrite the family history beyond omission. The daughter was neither explained nor acknowledged. She was simply removed, her existence compressed into a single burial line and then erased. Yet the photograph refused to comply with that erasure. It preserved what paper did not, holding onto the evidence of a presence that had not consented to disappearance. The technician imagined the day of the photograph with an unwanted clarity. The studio air thick with chemical smells, the father seated, the mother standing, the boys instructed not to move. And the daughter, newly dead or newly absent depending on whose truth one believed, positioned where she had always been, her hand placed on her father's shoulder in a gesture that felt both familiar and final. Whether she stood there in life or was carried there after death was a question the records could not answer. As the investigation closed in on certainty, the photograph itself seemed to resist final interpretation. It offered no dramatic revelation, no grotesque spectacle. Instead, it presented something quieter and more unsettling. The suggestion that the family had not taken the photograph to remember who remained, but to assert that their daughter had not truly left. In doing so, they had entrusted the camera with a truth they refused to write down. A truth that waited patiently for more than a century until someone looked closely enough to see it with them. Daughter's existence confirmed in ink and absence explained only by silence, the technician returned to the image one final time, aware that what remained hidden might not stay that way. The restoration software was capable of extracting detail buried deep within the photographic grain. Details never meant to survive a century of chemical decay. This stage of the process was usually reserved for textures and backgrounds, areas considered visually unimportant but useful for reconstructing context. It was there, within the painted backdrop of the studio wall, that the technician focused their attention, tracing the uneven patterns that had once been dismissed as decorative brushwork. At first, nothing changed. The wall remained what it had always appeared to be, a neutral surface meant to keep attention on the family. But as contrast adjustments were applied, inconsistencies emerged. The grain did not distribute evenly across the backdrop. In certain areas, it clustered, thickening unnaturally as though the emulsion had reacted to something beneath it. These clusters formed faint contours, barely perceptible unless isolated and magnified far beyond what casual viewing would allow. The technician layered enhancement over enhancement, not sharpening but separating information, pulling forward what the original exposure had captured and time had tried to dissolve. Slowly, the backdrop stopped behaving like a wall. Subtle curves appeared where none should exist, arcs that suggested depth rather than flat paint. A darker oval formed near the center of the shadowed mass, its edges soft but deliberate. The shape was positioned exactly where a head would be if the child's arm truly extended upward from the hand on the father's shoulder. As the clarity improved, the oval refined itself into a face, not a complete one, not cleanly defined, but unmistakable in its structure. A forehead emerged first, followed by the suggestion of cheeks pressed slightly forward, as though the figure were leaning in. The nose was faint, more absence than presence, but the eyes were impossible to ignore. They were darker than the surrounding tones, deep wells within the grain, aligned not with the family but directly outward, meeting the viewer's gaze across more than 100 years. The technician felt an instinctive pull back from the screen. Faces were powerful triggers, and this one carried an intensity that felt disproportionate to its incomplete form. The eyes did not carry the vacant softness common in old photographs. They were alert, focused, almost strained. The mouth, when it finally revealed itself, was not smiling. Its line curved downward, subtle but unmistakable, an expression that could not be dismissed as neutral or accidental. Unlike the hand, which had emerged cleanly and solidly, the face seemed to fight its own visibility. It flickered between clarity and obscurity as adjustments were made, retreating when sharpened too aggressively, reappearing when the image was treated with restraint. This behavior suggested it had not been meant to be seen clearly, as though the photograph itself resisted revealing too much. The technician adjusted settings carefully, coaxing rather than forcing the image forward. What became increasingly disturbing was how the face aligned with the family's positioning. The daughter's eyes were level with the father's head, slightly behind him, exactly where someone standing close would be. The angle of her gaze matched the direction of the camera lens, not skewed or distorted by perspective. This meant she had been facing forward at the moment of exposure, aware of the camera in a way that mirrored the living subjects. She was not an accidental impression. She was participating. The expression she wore did not match the solemnity of the rest of the family. Where the others displayed controlled restraint, her face carried something unresolved. There was tension in the set of her features, an intensity that suggested urgency rather than patience. It was the face of someone who wanted to be seen, or perhaps needed to be seen, caught between presence and erasure. The technician compared the face to the hand, overlaying outlines to ensure alignment. The proportions matched. The distance between eyes, the scale relative to the father's shoulder, all pointed to the same child identified in the records. There was no distortion consistent with double exposure or chemical accident. The face had been impressed into the photograph in the same moment as the rest of the family, subject to the same light, the same time, the same stillness. As the face grew clearer, another unsettling detail emerged. The grain around her eyes appeared denser, almost bruised, as though the photographic material had been stressed in that region. This was not degradation caused by age alone. It suggested an intensity of contrast at the moment the photograph was taken, as if light and shadow had struggled there more fiercely than elsewhere. The technician wondered, briefly and unwillingly, whether the struggle had been physical rather than optical. The emotional tone of the image shifted once again. The daughter's presence was no longer implied or partial. She was there watching. Her gaze pierced through the carefully arranged stillness of the family and fixed itself on the future, on whoever would eventually look closely enough to find her. The photograph ceased to feel like a relic and began to feel like a message delayed rather than lost. The technician sat with the image for a long time, resisting the urge to look away. There was no sense of malice in the face, no overt threat. What radiated from it was something quieter and more unsettling: insistence. a refusal to be smoothed away by time or record or polite omission. The daughter's face existed where the backdrop should have been, woven into the space meant to hide imperfections, asserting that the most important truth in the image had been concealed. Deliberately, when the enhancement process reached its limit, the face remained partially obscured, never fully resolving into the clarity of the living. It hovered between visibility and disappearance, as though bound by rules different from those governing the rest of the photograph. The technician understood then that this was not a flaw to be corrected. It was the photograph's final compromise, allowing the daughter to be seen just enough to prove she had been there, but never enough to be comfortably acknowledged. The final phase of restoration focused not on the hidden figure, but on the living faces that framed her, an effort to understand how the family related to what had been concealed for so long. The technician adjusted the image globally, balancing tones and refining edges across the entire composition, expecting only minor improvements in clarity. Instead, the process revealed a subtle but unmistakable pattern that bound the family together in a way that had been invisible before. Each figure, once thought to be arranged symmetrically for aesthetic balance, appeared slightly misaligned, their bodies angled inward by degrees so small they had escaped notice for more than a century. The father's chair was not square to the camera, as originally assumed. Its front legs were angled just enough to turn his torso toward the shadow behind him. His shoulders, once read as rigid, now showed a minute rotation, bringing his right side closer to the hidden presence. The line of his jaw, sharpened by restoration, pointed not forward but subtly toward the space where the daughter's face hovered in the backdrop. This was not the posture of a man centered on the lens. It was the posture of someone oriented towards something beside him. The mother's position confirmed the pattern. Her feet, barely visible beneath the hem of her dress, were not planted evenly. One foot was set back, shifting her weight toward the same area behind the father's shoulder. Her folded hands, once interpreted as a gesture of composure, were angled inward, the fingers aligned with the curve of the daughter's emerging face. Even her gaze, now clearer than before, did not meet the camera directly. It fell just short, converging on a point slightly to the side, a point that could only correspond to the child's position. The sons, positioned at the edges of the frame, revealed the most telling alignment. Their bodies were not parallel to the backdrop, but turned inward, their shoulders subtly slanted, as though they were standing around a center that was not visible. The older boy's eyes, sharpened by contrast adjustment, were no longer directed outward but inward and downward, tracing the same invisible line as his mother's gaze. The younger boy's posture, once dismissed as impatience, now appeared tense, his hands clenched as though instructed to remain still while something else occupied the space between them. What disturbed the technician was not the individual gestures, but their collective consistency. No one in the photograph was oriented fully toward the camera. The family, as a unit, was arranged around an unseen focal point, their bodies forming a loose arc that embraced the space behind the father. This was not accidental. Studio photographers of the era were precise, correcting posture and alignment to achieve visual harmony. For every subject to be angled incorrectly in the same direction suggested intention rather than error. The technician overlaid a compositional grid, tracing lines of sight and body orientation. The convergence was undeniable. Every line led back to the daughter. Even the negative space in the photograph seemed to bend toward her, the backdrop's patterns subtly warping around the area where her face emerged. The image behaved less like a flat record and more like a scene constructed around a presence that refused to be excluded, no matter how carefully it was hidden. This realization reframed everything that had come before. The family had not merely allowed the daughter to appear. They had arranged themselves around her. Whether by grief, denial, or defiance, they had composed the portrait as though she were still an acknowledged member, standing where she belonged. The camera, impartial and obedient, had recorded the truth of that arrangement, even as time and documentation attempted to deny it. The technician considered the possibility that this alignment had been subconscious, an unintentional echo of habit. Families stand together in familiar ways, drawn by routine and memory, yet the precision of the angles argued against coincidence. These were people trained to hold still, to follow instruction, to present themselves correctly. If they had chosen to break symmetry, they had done so collectively, silently agreeing on what the photograph was meant to represent. The emotional weight of the image deepened as this understanding settled in. The daughter was no longer a hidden anomaly or a spectral intrusion. She was the axis around which the family revolved. The living had adjusted themselves to accommodate her continued presence, shaping their bodies and gazes to include what records would later erase. The photograph became an act of quiet insistence, a refusal to let the child vanish entirely. The technician noticed one final detail as the restoration reached completion. The light across the family was not evenly distributed. It was brightest near the father's right shoulder, softening as it moved outward, as though the source had been angled to illuminate something just beyond him. This was not standard practice. Studio lighting was designed to center on faces, to flatten shadows and highlight features. Here, the brightest point fell on empty air, or what had once been assumed to be empty air. That light, preserved in silver and shadow, now made sense. It had been placed to reveal the daughter, even if only partially, even if only enough to ensure she would leave a trace. The family had stood where the light told them to stand, and the light had obeyed their unspoken arrangement. Together, they had created a composition that acknowledged the child without naming her, including her without explaining her, trusting the photograph to carry what words could not. As the technician saved the final restored image, there was no sense of closure, only a deepening awareness that the photograph had achieved exactly what the family intended. It had kept the daughter with them, not as a memory softened by time, but as a presence embedded into the structure of the image itself, visible only to those willing to look closely enough to see how every living figure still leaned toward her, as though she had never left at all.